everybody. Welcome to another episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Glenn Beckman, sitting in for Jim Cardoso today on At the Boundary. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk with the author of an article that appears in the latest special issue of our academic journal, the Journal of Strategic Security. This latest issue, published a few weeks ago, focuses specifically on the Russia-Ukraine war. It features 16 in-depth articles examining the war from nearly every angle. Our guest today, Daniel Arms, is a 15-year veteran of the Florida National Guard. He's also a field historian at U.S. SOCOM. Arms' article focuses on the historical context of the conflict, as Ukraine's struggle to be a free and independent state dates back centuries, with both Russia and Europe staking claims to Ukraine's legacy. He'll be speaking today with GNSI Strategy and Research Manager Dr. Tad Schnaufer, himself a 17-year veteran of the Florida National Guard, who spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, including deployments with the Florida Guard. Let's listen in as they discuss Slava Ukraine, solving Ukraine's present with the past.
Well, Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tad. Good to be here.
Excellent. You know, you wrote an awesome article for the Journal of Strategic Security recently, covering the mixed history as well as the religious and cultural background between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So obviously, they have a shared history for most of their existence. And that spawns into how they use and narrate that history today. So why don't we start at the beginning? Where do we see Russian and Ukrainian history first merging? And then how did it eventually kind of spawn off into two separate lines?
So the ancestry for the Russians and the Ukrainians goes back to the 800s. So we immediately delve into a history that is long before anyone, especially in America, really reads about. They came from Norway, and it was the Vikings. So the Vikings were looking to they were looking for trade routes to the Mediterranean from the Baltic. And in their search for those trade routes, they end up in the Lake Ladoga area, and that's where some of the first Rus settlements were. They integrated with the local population, which were the Finns, and that's where the Russians come from. And then the Ukrainians, they integrated a little further south with the local populations that were there. And those populations grew for about 200 years, and then they ran into the Byzantine Empire when they finally made it down to the Black Sea. And from there, that's really where we start seeing the beginning of the Russian culture. They really emulated the Byzantine Empire. They saw what they had. They loved their architecture, which is why all Russian culture really emulates the things that the Byzantine Empire had. As far as that, they saw that, and they saw the block and the brick and the metalwork, and they looked at that, and they looked at their wooden architecture that they had brought with them, and they said they wanted everything that the Byzantines had. So they did a really good job of adopting that. Along with that, they adopted Christianity. So Christianity, as I talk about in the paper, has that big split in 1054. As a result of differences between the Catholic Church, which was in the West, they spoke Latin. So the Byzantines, they were Greek. So obviously they spoke Greek, and they had some differences that had really been building for 400 years. As far as, the role of the Pope, who's the head of the church, what's his job, different things, the original sin, what both sides of Christianity thought that meant, and then other topics that they couldn't reconcile. And that really finally came to a head in 1054 with this Great Schism. And the interesting part was it was down to one letter. So the Great Schism was based on one letter that they couldn't decide, or that that both sides couldn't reconcile where the Holy Spirit came from. So that was an issue that the Byzantines sent their envoys to Rome to go talk to the Pope, and the Pope did likewise. And it ended up both sides excommunicating each other. So that was the big schism. And that in my papers is what I trace the religious breakup between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
So with that religious division between the Great Schism, this divide between East and West, what aspects of that play out even today? So almost 1,000 years later, you still have this religious divide that's playing out in the current war.
So if it wasn't complicated enough with the issues of the Great Schism, there have been multiple attempts over the last, since 1054 to reunite the Eastern and the Western churches. And that's where this Uniate Church came from. In the 1200s, I believe it was, they tried an effort at unification, and it didn't work. The Uniate Church was the one effort at reuniting the churches that actually did work, and they kept the liturgy of the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. They essentially ignored the issues that had caused the rift in the first place. So you've got the Catholic Church that sees this as reconciling, but then you've got the Orthodox Church, which sees it as, kind of reconciling. But at the same time, the Orthodox Church considers the Catholic Church heretical, and they consider Moscow to be the third Rome. So they see themselves as the only church, and the Uniate Church kind of as just, almost as a way for, back in the day, they would say it was a way for Poland to exert influence over Russia and to convert Russians to Catholicism.
Right. Yeah, because Ukraine's right there, obviously right there on the border between those two. And that's where you see the history that they have had with the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with the Lithuanians converted to Catholicism. You have that influence. And then on the other side of it, you have the Russians and the Orthodox.
Mm-hmm. And going back to some of the history, so in one of the conflicts that I addressed in the paper, there was King Daniel, who converted to Catholicism so that he could get the European powers to fight the Mongols. He wanted a crusade, essentially. And the Pope said, okay, you'll get a crusade, but you have to convert to Catholicism.
And where was King Daniel out of? Was he out of Kyiv, or where was he out of?
Yes, he was the prince of the Rus in Kiev.
Mm-hmm.
So 1240, the Mongols sacked Kiev 3 times. Mm-hmm. And that's what I consider the cultural division between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Because when he asked for that crusade, Europe didn't come to help, and there was no one to help him. So essentially, he had to resubmit to the Mongols, and Kiev was sacked 3 times, like I said, and that was the start of the Rus diaspora. You had you had Rus go west to Lviv, and then east to Novgorod, and that's where your historic Russians come from. Interesting enough, Lviv was actually founded in 1265 by King Daniel's son. So it's actually named after Leo, who was the eldest son of King Daniel. So with that being a Polish-Lithuanian city, the Lithuanians also claim ancestry to the Rus heritage because, well, their one city that was in their commonwealth was founded by King Daniel, by King Daniel's son, who essentially was like the guy for the Rus people.
Well, and that's interesting to see as the Rus people spread out across to some of the other principalities, so Novgorod, Muscovy. So how did those rise up? And then how does this narrative play into the current conflict?
So Muscovy was sacked by the Mongols, but it didn't suffer the same fate as Kiev. Kiev is significantly south of Moscow. So even though the Mongols were able to conquer that area, their influence wasn't as significant as it was in Kiev. So the Muscovites were able to form more of a cultural center. And there really wasn't much left in Kiev. Like I said, it was sacked 3 times. They razed the city to the ground. So your cultural centers then became Novgorod, which was the capital for, eventually it moved to Moscow, and then that's where the Russians come from. But then in Lviv, it was Catholic. So we see these 2 cultural centers, one that is Orthodox and one that's Catholic.
And within the Rus people themselves. So you see a divide within the same peoples who is spread out because of the Mongol invasion. And then now they're creating these external influences on the religious back with the Catholics from the Polish-Lithuanians and then the traditional Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, so you're seeing these, and I'm just going to say Russian because they're Rus.
Right.
People, but you see these Russians, like they were 200 years ago, they were the same families. And then you have this, Kyiv is sacked, and then they have this diaspora. So by the 1400s, you have 2 completely different cultures.
So when does the Ukrainian identity really? So you're noting that it's the Mongol invasion is kind of when that Ukrainian identity starts to form. Is that how your argument's formulated?
So the Ukrainian people were. It's a not a black and white question because there have always been Rus people living in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So they consider themselves Ukrainians because they've been in the land for 1,200, for hundreds of, 1,000 years. Ukraine didn't really become a term until the 1800s. Mm-hmm. So they just saw themselves as the people that lived there. They were the Cossacks. It really wasn't a Ukrainian thing. They were the residents. They were the Rus people that just had always lived there. And it was really a battle between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Russia. And then the Ukrainians were the people that had been living there. So they had their identity based on their ancestry.
Mm-hmm. And so how does that today play out? So how does both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, how do they communicate their history?
So a lot changed in the 20th century. So with the Russian Revolution, Ukraine had its first chance of independence in 1917. And they were briefly, it was briefly the Ukrainian Republic from 1917 to 1921. And then it became the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. And what Stalin believed with socialism was that it's ethnic based. So in between 1921 and even through World War II and beyond, there were mass migrations forced by the government. They wanted people to live in their ancestral heritage land. So when we look at Ukraine now, the reason you see a high concentration of Russians in eastern Ukraine is because Stalin wanted it that way. He wanted the ethnic, homogeny to be in the land that the peoples came from. So when he did that, effectively, he made Western Ukraine to be more under the Polish influence, and then Eastern Ukraine took on more of a Russian influence. Even though he did create that border that this is the country of Ukraine now, but he separated the heritage.
Mm-hmm. And so what about, as we come up to today, Putin had his big article in 2021 leading up to the 2022 invasion. He talks about the Russians and Ukrainian people and how they're pretty much one people. So how does this history of these two peoples kind of intertwining, as we've discussed, the religious base, how does Putin say that this is playing out?
He looks at it from the state perspective. So there's some treaties with Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, where they rejected Mongol influence. Peter the Great defeated the Swedes and European powers and reconquered land. Catherine the Great was able to expel the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire from historic Russian territory. And Putin looks at that from the state perspective of, well, we are Russia. We're the ones that are actually protecting this land. So we are the Russians. And Ukraine looks at it as, again, they're the people that have always lived there. They just haven't been given a voice or the opportunity to really have a say in it. Because with all these treaties, whether it's between Poland and Lithuania, Russia, the Ottomans, the Mongols, Ukraine is given almost like they're given a seat at the table only to, placate them, like make them think that they have some say in it. But then when it comes to making the decisions, they're really left out. And you see that a lot with the treaties in World War I and World War II. The Allied powers didn't really acknowledge Ukraine. They weren't familiar with it. They didn't know much about it. So when it came time to split up, to the winner goes the spoils, Ukraine was left out of it. And Russia was, kind of given whatever they wanted. So that's how it typically works out for Ukraine.
So does the current 2022 war, to the present, does that have a religious element to it?
The Russians would say it does, just because they don't see this as a 10-year war. They see this as, Putin draws this back to the 1700s, and he says that that this is them protecting, their ancestral lands, which are Orthodox lands. And with the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church, under the current administration, with the current patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, they are very much intertwined. So the current head of the Russian Orthodox Church is very much pro-Russian. So he sees this as a military effort to regain Russian Orthodox, the old Russian Orthodox land.
And what, from the Ukrainian perspective, what's church and leadership are they pulling in this case? So because they're not they have some Catholic populations, but they also have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There's a couple other churches that are dealing with it. So what's it on their side?
The Ukrainians pulled away from religion as one of the main factors for their nation building back in the 1800s or around World War I. They were able to build some independence movements that really transcended religion. So in the Galicia Volhynia area, which is it's southwestern Ukraine, heavy influenced by Poland, by the Catholics, they were able to supply the Eastern Ukrainians with a lot of the intelligence. They had a lot of the material. So they were able to put, literature. They were able to do books and pamphlets and a lot of ways to spread ideas. So they were able to be the logistics for the Eastern Ukrainians who were Orthodox. So the two movements kind of worked together because they saw that they needed each other. And for the first time in the history of Ukraine, it kind of transcended religion and became more of a politics united them more than religion.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We see that today, obviously, with the external threats from Russia. So what, going back to your article, what's the big point that you're trying to get across when someone picks this article up and starts reading it? What are the key point that you want them to take away?
The first point, and it's I don't know if it's the most serious point, but I just want people to understand that this is not a conflict that started in 2014. Mm-hmm. I want people to understand that, here in America, we're like 250 years old. But in 1985, Kiev celebrated their 1500th anniversary. And they had coins minted for it. And we tend to have this very short-sighted view on history that if it didn't happen in our lifetime, it doesn't matter. Whereas you go to Eastern Europe or to these places that have existed for 1,000, 1,500 years, they draw on their history to legitimize their actions that they do now. Mm. So when policymakers look at what's going on over there now, it's okay to not have an understanding of, or not have necessarily an answer, because it's hard to explain to somebody how 1,500 years of history legitimizes in a person's actions now. Mm-hmm. When we're trying to say that, something that happened 5 years ago shouldn't set precedent for something that we're going to do today. So it's really, the point of my paper was to give people a better understanding of, there's parts of the world that have a very different understanding of time than we do. And if we want to be advisors and policymakers and influence policy and decisions that are being made over there, we have to understand where the people are coming from.
No, I think it's an excellent point, and your paper draws that out well, that other countries can see history differently. And in this case, even the Russians and Ukrainians see their own histories differently. And they use those narratives that you said to legitimize their actions, to legitimize their current government scheme, and then also to add credence to why they fight, to what land is theirs and what land is not. Because if you look at a map of Europe, you don't see Ukraine pop up until
until the 1900s.
It's the 1900s. So when Ukraine says we have this 1,000-year history, it's like, well, where are you on the? I'm not seeing you on the map, and it makes it difficult in some ways for them to craft that narrative to ensure we are our own people. We have our own whether it's religious, cultural, language, heritage. The Russians, and going back to how Putin frames it, is that they're essentially just Russian peoples, just like the Belarusians and other groups that the Russians pretty much claim that they're just Russians.
Yeah, and ignorance has really played a significant part in the history of Ukraine with the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Riga, the treaties that they essentially affected Ukraine at the end of World War I, there was so much mistrust in the Allies as far as Ukraine because they didn't have an understanding of what Ukraine was.
Mm.
A lot of the Allies thought that Ukraine was Russia, or that it was, so similar to Russia that it was going to pretty much fall in line with exactly what Russia wanted to do. But if you read what the people that were leading the independence movement in Ukraine were trying to do during the First World War, like they weren't Soviets necessarily. So they truly wanted an independent Ukraine. And unfortunately, sometimes Ukrainian leaders will do what they have to do to secure independence. And unfortunately, it made them look like they were siding with Russia, especially in World War I. So that hurt them. But ignorance has hurt Ukraine, especially in a globalized society.
It's interesting because in the aftermath of World War I, a lot of the peace agreements were focused on self-determination. That's where you see the reintroduction of Poland back onto the map. Poland was off the map for about just over 120 years at that point, as we're looking at 1918, 1919. So with that in mind, the Ukrainians not getting that self-determination, obviously their political movement was not able to get out their message to the leading powers. And maybe that's something that they're still dealing with today, is getting the message out and, making sure that they're on not only on the map, but people know where they are, what they stand for, and, where they're trying to go.
Yeah, and Stalin's policies, Stalin devastated Ukraine, especially with the 5-year plans and the famines and everything. But splitting people into the ethnic regions really helped solidify now the independence movements of Ukraine. Because you look at Western Ukraine, or you look at almost all of Ukraine, like they are hardcore pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian. And then you look at the resistance that Ukraine is offering now, because not to justify what he did, but Stalin's ethnic breakup of the country really made the resistance movements, or were the precursor to the resistance movements that we see today, because he concentrated ethnic Ukrainians back into their own land. So now they're saying we've been here the whole time and we actually can fight for ourselves.
So does this history piece actually play a role that, does it actually influence the events, or is it just Putin saying, hey, we're using history to justify our actions, and maybe Zelensky does, the same thing for the Ukrainian side? How much influence does it actually carry from your perspective?
I mean, in Eastern Europe, tradition is so emphasized. With the Russian Orthodox Church, it's very much tradition based, and they bring up tradition all the time. They use tradition to justify, a lot of the doctrines that they have. So it's just carrying over to everything else that they do. So they see this as a tradition, as something that always has been, as something that shouldn't change.
Is it righting a wrong, in a sense, that the Ukraine got its own independence and the Russians feel like they,
I mean, that's probably one of the contentious issues, because the Russians would say, well, we are righting a wrong.
Right.
We are returning ethnic Russians and imperial Russian land back to us.
Right, yeah.
Whereas the Ukrainians are saying, well, we're righting a wrong that should never have happened, and that, we finally get a voice, we finally have the ability to self-determination and to answer for ourselves.
Well, what can we expect as the conflict obviously continues? There's some peace talks, there's negotiations, but what can we expect the role of history, religion, the number of factors that you mentioned in your paper? How do you foresee those playing out in the next year or so as the conflict continues, and hopefully there's some sort of peace deal in the near future?
That's such a tough question because I thought that the peace deal was going to be reached before this paper published. I was kind of excited to see what would come of that, but I think we should expect that history doesn't move as fast as we think it does. Mm-hmm. So you look at all the conflicts that Ukraine has been through in the past, and we try to summarize that. And then when you look at it, some of those conflicts took decades. Mm-hmm. So in the scope of things, 2022 to 2026 is only 4 years. I would love if they could come to some quicker cessation of hostilities due to the technology and the speed that the world moves at today. But I think it tells us that both sides are no less determined to their ideology than they were 1,000 years ago.
Fascinating point. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for hosting me.
Perhaps there is hope for Ukraine in its past, but first, that country and its people need to find a way to escape the present. Many thanks today to author Daniel Arms for discussing his article in the most recent special issue of our academic journal, the Journal of Strategic Security. Thanks as well to Tad Schnaufer for sharing the insights and experiences he gained while spending considerable time in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. We hope you enjoyed their conversation today. By the way, you can find this special Ukraine issue of the JSS online. We publish the journal quarterly in cooperation with USF Libraries. It's also the last issue from Editor-in-Chief Jay Tamzett. He's edited the journal since its inception in 2008. He's heading off to new adventures, but he leaves behind a great legacy. 2 million plus downloads of the journal, as well as a journal that's ranked by Google Scholar in the top 10% of all military studies journals. Many thanks to Jay, and we wish him great success in his new chapter. Before we let you go today, a couple of quick notes. More great news involving USF this week. A new story shows the university is increasing its investment in research faster than the vast majority of its AAU peers. The story shows USF increased its research investment in 2024 by 13% year over year. That's a bigger increase than 90% of AAU members. USF is currently ranked number 47, according to the story, among all 422 public universities. You can read more on it on the USF website. We'll post a link. And a big feather in the cap this week for the city of Tampa, as it was named the 5th best city in America for corporate headquarters, according to the magazine's Site Selection. A local economic development leader credits USF with playing a key role in that ranking. In an article published by Tampa Bay Business and Wealth, Craig Richard, president and CEO of the Tampa Bay Economic Development Council, praised the relationship between USF and the EDC, saying, quote, "From the start, USF has been more than a partner. USF has charted our course for connecting talent, research, and entrepreneurship," end quote. Read the article for yourself. We'll drop a link in the show notes. Don't forget about some great events coming up on our calendar. On February 11th at the USF St. Pete campus will be the annual St. Petersburg Conference on World Affairs. This year's theme, Outer Space, International Collaboration and Competition. On March 11th, we're happy to announce the rescheduled date for Cyber Beacon, the flagship conference from the College of Information and Cyberspace from the National Defense University. It's the first time CIC has taken their conference on the road, and we're super excited to host them here at USF. If you recall, it was originally scheduled for October, but the federal government shutdown caused the postponement. But we now have the event officially rescheduled, March 11th. This year's theme, Cyber and Information Reimagined, Artificial Intelligence as a Strategic Advantage. And on March 24th and 25th, we'll host GNSI Tampa Summit 6 here at USF. This year's summit is themed Cracks in the Lamp, Freeing the Nuclear Genie, and examines the question of whether or not we're heading into a new nuclear age. We'll drop links to all of these events in the show notes. Be sure to visit our YouTube channel. We've dropped a couple of new videos there. Episode 5 of General Mackenzie's Studies of Generalship series, as well as an interview with Dr. Austin Becker from the University of Rhode Island. That's a follow-up interview to the Florida Security Forum Port and Maritime Security event in November. Next week on the podcast, we're happy to welcome retired Coast Guard Rear Admiral Mark Fedor, who's now working with a veteran-owned company called Operator Solutions, which specializes in solutions for the commercial and private spaceflight sectors. That includes the recovery of what colloquially is known as space junk. There are quite literally tons and tons of it up there, and he's going to talk to us about he and his team take care of it. Should be an interesting conversation. We hope you can join us for that. Thanks for listening today. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, let your friends and colleagues know, and ask them to subscribe as well. You can follow GNSI on our LinkedIn and X accounts at USF_GNSI. And check out our website as well, usf.edu/GNSI. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be worthy of attention and discussion. I'm Glenn Beckman, sitting in for Jim Cardoso this week. Thanks for listening today. We'll see you next week at the Boundary.